we're all going to struggle. And I think it's really important to me as a leader is at times I know I'm going to have to believe more in somebody than what they believe in themselves. And I need them to understand that, hear me, and then we create a plan to get there.
Have you ever had a leader see more potential in you than you saw in yourself? If you have, wasn't that exhilarating? And it probably didn't cause you to underperform, did it? I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast, a production of the People Forward Network. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from Greg Muccio of Southwest Airlines. Southwest is known the world over for its unique perspective on leadership, a fun-loving and service-oriented culture, and its ability to consistently earn profit. And when I say earn, I mean earn. Up until the COVID-19 pandemic hit the world, Southwest Airlines had posted 47 consecutive years of profitability. What does it take to produce that kind of performance while serving 121 locations in 11 countries? Answer, 64,000 aligned and talented people. And that's where today's guest comes in. Greg Muccio isn't just a longtime employee of Southwest Airlines, he is its head of talent acquisition. With that role has come a raft of challenges, especially in light of what COVID-19 has done to the travel industry, as well as its influence on perspectives about work overall that have ultimately reduced the overall labor pool. In our conversation, you'll hear how Greg overcomes these hurdles. It involves three key words: belief, vision, and hope. Greg takes a very personal approach to the issues of belief and vision that are a little bit different than what we might normally think of when we hear those words. And with regard to hope, well, I'll let you hear it in his own words better than I could say it, but suffice to say, he sees the issue of hope as a serious leadership responsibility. Believing in people, even when they don't necessarily believe in themselves, isn't just something Greg does for others. It is something that was done for him early on in his career. And that is where we begin.
I'm definitely a product of a lot of people. I don't have like this short list of folks where it's like, oh, I really wanted to emulate them. It is more of like, man, I really like how this person does this, and I would like to do that more like that. More and more, I definitely feel like I'm becoming more my father's son. And what I always just loved about him was just he really never met a stranger and would just talk to anybody, anywhere. And the prince and the pauper both were equally important to him, if that makes sense. He just always made whoever the other person was or people will feel really important. So, I got that from there. I've had some really great leaders that I've been blessed with, especially here at Southwest. I've got people that have reported to me over the years that I have learned so much from, or just would be like, golly, man, I'm not letting them go until I either master that or whatever, because it's really good. And then I think at the end, Tim, too, there's even been at times leaders or others that I've encountered and I haven't liked that experience, but that's probably impacted me just as much as like, I don't ever want to make someone feel like I did for whether it was that moment, that week, that project, that year, whatever it was. And that's probably shaped me as much as anything, is the things not to do, I guess.
We've had some people we've had a chance to visit with for the podcast who's, as they talk about their past, the number one thing they have to share is the person that they are working to not be. It's not the most fun way to learn, to have to go through being under somebody's leadership like that, but it is profound and it does shape us. I want to go back to your dad for just a second, because as you were describing him, I heard that he saw people. I heard that when you talk about the prince and the pauper, like, to me, that says that he saw value in everyone, regardless of their station in life. And when I think about the leadership perspectives that Southwest is famous for around servant leadership, I would say that worldview of seeing value in everybody is a pretty critical perspective to be able to show up as somebody who's going to serve while leading.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your role. Southwest Airlines, obviously incredibly well-known organization, very successful over the course of many decades. But talent acquisition in this particular moment, as we're recording this, it is November of 2022. So everybody can do the math as to all that is swirling around. But what is it like to be leading talent acquisition in this environment?
It's crazy. You hear the double-edged sword type of analogies all the time. And, I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago and was sharing with somebody, and I was like, hey, the really great news is that, have a stronger seat at the table and we're getting asked what we think. The bad news is we have a stronger seat at the table and we're getting asked what we think. And that's what it feels like. And especially in the hospitality industry, right? Because, going back, right? So lots of folks and lots of industries got just decimated during the pandemic. But I think the travel hospitality one was certainly up at the top, right? When you see what happened. And then us, like many others that are in this, it is a very people centric business. And so in order for us to operate effectively, it does take people. And so to immediately go from everything that happened there to then ramping back up with all the things that are happening now in this TA space, it's definitely challenging. And then Southwest, we place a premium on our people. That is what we would call our secret sauce or our most competitive advantage. We've always said is our people. And so it's not, my team and our role isn't just about, hey, we've got to go fill seats. Like they've got to be filled with the right person as well.
Just to help people understand a little bit of the scope, give folks a bit of an idea about the volume of talent acquisition that you're currently navigating.
Our biggest year pre-pandemic, I want to say might have been 2018. And we hired somewhere in the range of maybe about 7,500 external individuals and another 1,500 to 2,000 internal hires. This year, we're just externally, we're already over 17,000, and we're sort of considered the first airline to get back to kind of that pre-pandemic staffing. And I think we shared about this in our pre-conversation. What makes an airline very unique compared to, I think, other industries, just even in the hospitality, right? So whether it's a restaurant or a hotel or whatever, obviously, if you're not staffed, you lose business and money, but you just sort of like, hey, we won't open up as many tables or as many rooms or whatever. Just there's no partly way of like that we're, hey, Tim, I know you wanted to go from, San Francisco to New York. We're going to drop you off in Kansas City if that's okay, because that's all we got. It just doesn't work that way. And then, same kind of thing, even if any of those businesses, if somebody calls in sick. I was at a pretty large store chain yesterday and I was like, man, worst case scenario, if they were really shorthanded there, they have a couple long lines. And if you were to walk into a customer, you just sort of make a decision. I'll stand in the line or I just come back a different time. Well, it once again kind of doesn't work that way. We've got customers that are all over the place. And then we just have a dynamic that the FAA, our crew, can only work so many hours, and then legally they are timed out. And so that can happen. And then you can have really bad weather. The restaurant and the store is not going to close, but it impacts us. And then the domino is that it impacts those crews. There's actually a need to be somewhat overstaffed or staffed to the piece where we have the ability to pivot when things like that happen.
You have thoroughly convinced me to not get into the airline business right there. What a unique set of challenges for the entire industry to have to navigate. Of course, at a certain level, it's always been that way, but we're also now in this post-pandemic reality and having lived through the pandemic. What is different about talent acquisition now for you than, say, 3 years ago?
Unemployment was fairly low back then, but it was very focused on what I would call your more professional, your technology positions, right? And so those were hard. You had to work hard at those. And if we were recruiting you for a role or had found you, it was just really about, hey, does this opportunity at Southwest, does this sound like the right move for you better than where you are? Fast forward to now, okay, you've got multiple opportunities. It's not about that even anymore. It's what else is poking at you. But for those of us that employ a large amount of hourly employees, that's where the game's changed a ton. Is just if you just look at the shortage or the number of hourly jobs or just what the demands are there, it's something we all scratch our head on. Unstable is a one word that I would kind of use to describe it because it really is. I've been asked before, hey, what's your solution? And I'm like, I don't know that I have one. I'm not pessimistic from, hey, we can't do the job, but it may be that we've got to do what we can, obviously, to work smarter, but we're also going to just have to work harder, right? Like that, there's an element of that where we just have to roll up our sleeves and go after it, and just realize that throughout the process, we're going to have more fallout than we've ever experienced before. And it's not necessarily a poor reflection on the company hiring. Sometimes it is. We're always looking at what we can do better, but you got to realize that the individuals have a lot of options. And I think the number of individuals that are truly capable of working and skilled at it that really are not interested in participating in the job market, that's just switched a lot. So there's just this element of like, I got to find the person that wants to kind of come in and work and do this kind of work. And then is Southwest the right place for them to do it?
When I think about all the challenges that you just described, previously you were speaking systemically to the airline industry, but now on top of it, these very unique times that we're living in, I think it's a good segue into, I know something that you care a lot about and think about, which is the issue of hope. Because there is the reality that you are heading up the acquisition of talent, as it were. But that means that you're leading a team. You're leading a team in a challenging environment, in a challenging industry. And I know that one of the things that you see as the leader's responsibility is hope. Talk a little bit about how you see hope and the leader's responsibility in it.
I think hope is one of the most powerful things that we have, right? And it can get us through some of the darkest times, day, whatever it is. But I think there's a unique quality of hope, which is that you either give it or you take it. It doesn't really have a neutral status to it, right? So many people are struggling and there's still just a lot of uncertainty with everything. As we talk, there's, today, within the last few weeks, there's been some layoffs of some pretty big name companies, right? And that I would have assumed for the most part, that's like, wow, I'm set. And so I just, as we went through the pandemic, especially, I think hope was in scarce supply and a desperate demand. And I think that was an opportunity, certainly for leaders, to give folks that just there weren't answers anywhere. And how do I get a glimmer of hope for the next day, the next week, that type of thing.
How do you manage that with yourself? Because what I hear is a supreme amount of responsibility. I have a team I'm leading. I need to make sure that I am bringing hope to the equation because there are challenging times, especially now, but always the leader's responsibility. But then again, there's the reality for you on the inside as well. What are you experiencing? What are you seeing? So how do you, in an authentic way, manage the issue of hope within yourself so that you have something to give and bring to your team?
That's a really great question. And it's actually one that I've been a little transparent with my team and a little humble in that I haven't always maybe done the best job of taking care of myself. And I say that to them, especially to my other leaders, because I don't want them to do the same thing. And we've kind of we use this for sort of a leadership piece here, right? And it's a play on words from when you fly, right? But if like when we're giving the instructions when you fly and they start talking about the oxygen mask, how they always tell the parent, put yours on first before you put on your kids, which is, as a parent, something that you would actually go, no, I'm going to take care of my kid first. But the whole point of that is if something happens to you, then no one's putting on your kid's mask or whatever. And so just the whole story behind that is kind of taking care of yourself. And so trying to do better, just of doing those, making sure that I'm getting recharged or whatever. But I will tell you that, I don't know, I think that's a muscle I've been building for a while. And I find hope certainly in a lot of other people's stories or things that we read. And sometimes it's just adding up all those pieces of evidence that are out there, right? That, and just kind of building upon it and then wanting to do my part.
I think that idea, the old airline adage around the oxygen mask, is probably the most common analogy that is used about self-care and self-management in order to have something to give to others, in order to have something to lead out of. You just happen to actually work in the airline industry.
Yeah,
so,
you got a few laying around, I guess, maybe is,
yeah.
Right? So I don't know.
Yeah, so not too far off. Tell me a little bit about, I know that something else that you're passionate about, that you believe in, is this idea that people need to understand the significance of their contribution. Talk a little bit about that, if you could.
I don't care what you do for a living. There is a point in time that it begins to feel like a grind, even if it's for a short period of time. There is. And I think that why you're doing it is really important, and beyond like, okay, hey, it's a paycheck and there's these things or whatever. And those are certainly can be nice and can be good motivators. But when I look at, hey, I've got somebody on, they're doing, I don't know, a couple hundred interviews in a month for the same role or whatever. And so just helping them understand what that means. And for example, one of the positions that we hire the most is the ramp agent, which is that person below the wing. That's who's kind of marshaling the plane. Usually when you see them, they're the ones putting the bags on and off the plane. And it is a hard job. And so we have to do a lot of interviews for it because it's outside, it's physical. So you can imagine that it takes a while to find enough individuals. But to be able to go back and explain to that team that, okay, by getting this particular location staffed, what you have done is, and you start walking through that, okay, all the other people that work there on that team now have a healthier work-life balance because they're maybe not having to do overtime. Those roles have so much to do with on-time performance and obviously your bags getting there and just the value of that. But as we go, just adding all those things. And so it was a lot of fun the past 6 months as I've been bringing in other leaders to share with my team, what it means, including the financial piece to the bottom line that says, hey, by you getting this airport location, it allowed us to run every gate at full capacity, which the far altruistic side of it is, it allowed us to serve a lot, more people, provide more options for them to go. And then on the other end, it's, we are a for-profit business and the planes only make money when they're up in the air. And so the more, that you're contributing to that, and that can just get really lost. And I think it's just so important for individuals to be able to understand. And an analogy that I always like to use, right, is I'm a pretty big sports fan, and on Sports Center, what are the highlights? Just typically see the touchdown being scored, whatever it is, the pass, the run, or whatever, right? What you don't see is like the 3 or 4 key blocks or whatever that happened. But that's what the good leader that's the head coach will do in watching film. And I guarantee you, they won't spend that much time on the running back or whoever doing that. What they will keep going over and over is saying that block, that unselfish, unnamed, that no one saw and your name didn't called out. That's why he had the lane to run. That's why we scored a touchdown. That's just what a good leader is showing those folks, that the other 10 people that were on that play, that name didn't get mentioned, maybe weren't even on TV or whatever, but it's like, by you doing what you were supposed to do, even if you're a receiver, that you ran the route like you were going to get thrown the ball versus kind of just jogging it out, going, hey, you sold this, thus took this person out. And I just, that's just very valuable because you're going to ask that person to go do it again.
That's a great point. And I could just imagine, everybody forgive us while we just stick with football stories here, but I could just imagine the position coach in the film room. There's a big play. every single person did their job. Yes, the running back is the one that stuck the ball in the end zone, but I just imagine a coach who's really good, what you're describing. I'm making sure that everybody understands, and again, here comes the language, that the blocking and tackling is getting done, the stuff that is not sexy and not talked about. But let's watch this play. We'll just watch it once for the fun of it because we scored. Now we're going to watch it 10 more times, and we're going to watch every single person do their job. You can go through every single position and say, good job, look what you did. Scott Van Pelt's not going to talk about that on SportsCenter, but what a great example, what a great analogy for us to think about, okay, in our businesses, where are those mundane but so critical if we didn't do it? You may not be getting cheered by everybody else for that, but I'm going to cheer for you because I want you to know how important. What a great example.
Oftentimes, too, if you look back right on maybe some of your favorite teams that won a championship or whatever, I guarantee you typically they're certainly going to have their fair share of those unsung hero groups or whatever that just show up and do that particular piece. But they're also usually going to have a superstar or two that is willing to do the unselfish things and says, you know what, I don't need to score. I want to win more than anything else. And so on this particular play, I'm going to be a decoy or I'm going to block or whatever it may be. Basketball does this and hockey does this really, really well where they have this plus minus rating. And I don't know if you've ever heard of that. I am just enamored with that. And the whole scope is just, if Greg or Tim are on the court, how does their team perform overall, right? And that's where you get your plus and minus. And so, it doesn't matter if you are a player that scores 30 points, if the guy that you're guarding scores 40 or that kind of thing. And I've had conversations with folks before that's like, hey, you're really great at this, but the team doesn't do as well. And looking at kind of where some of those kind of things are. And so that's really, it's actually something that I've built in a little bit into my leadership. Or just as I'm interviewing people or looking for people on my team to just like, hey, what's their plus minus going to be? Like they may be the greatest sorcerer of talent of all time. But if it's all about them and they run other good people off or they wear out or whatever it is, it's like at the end of the day, we're going to lose. Their little stat sheet may look nice, but we're not going to win as a team.
All of this discussion around kind of the interaction between the leader and individuals on the team and how are you helping individuals on the team to not only see the big picture, but also to see their contribution to it and how it all fits together. That brings us really nicely into something else I know that you have thoughts about, which is the issue of vision. And so many times when we talk about vision, we have these soaring pictures of all these incredible accomplishments and things we're going to do. But you have that plus another take on it that has to do with landing, what I'll say, on the kitchen table of the individual. Share a little bit about your perspective about vision and how it extends, not just into the big organizational stuff, but really into the individual lives of people that you're leading.
I think it is a dovetail right out of the contribution piece, right? Because I think all of us at our core want some feeling of purpose in what we're doing. And does it matter? Does it make a difference? And so I think it's really important as a leader for you to be able to share the vision of your organization or your team or, even if it's just a project or an assignment that says, hey, here's what I'd like to see happen. And then you got to create something so that everybody else not only sees that vision, but the part that they play in it, right? And where that is and what that can do for them in the short term or the long term, whatever else it is.
You mean in terms of their career, their trajectory?
Yeah. And sometimes, I've had ones where you can tell someone's kind of reluctant and just, it's like, hey, I know you want to go to this spot. Some of these things have to happen. And just even how we talked about early in this conversation, some of my best learnings and growth have been on the worst assignments that I've had, right? Just because there's just even the grit and perseverance that you have to kind of get through that is huge. And so then it's like you learn those things and just talking to people, just kind of going, hey, don't discount all the other things that are happening to you while you're working on it. I know this may not be the greatest assignment. I get that, but don't discount maybe who you might be interacting with, who you might be learning. It's like, yeah, guess what? I partnered you with somebody that's somewhat challenging. You want to be a leader someday. Guess what? You are not going to get blessed with everybody that does everything you want to do the way you want to do it all the time. And so just, being able to help them see where that is for them, the vision for that next steps. And then I think too, with that, Tim, right, is the timeline or speed of that never happens at the same that you wanted. And that's for me true personally. A lot of times when I'm talking to somebody, I like to tell them how many times I interviewed before I got my first leadership position, and they look at the role that I'm in now and they're just, what? And it's just like,
what's the answer to that question, Greg?
It's like 7.
See, you just encouraged a bunch of people that are listening. That's why I wanted them to hear it too.
Yeah. And so, and just the number of times, and it was just like, holy cow. And luckily I had people that would pour into me, but I like to tell that because it's like, yeah, now I'm blessed. I'm senior director, head of TA at a fairly iconic company with a lot of responsibility. And I didn't just go from this one role to this. And there's all these steps. And there was a lot of failure before I ever got to here. Because I think everyone's kind of in a hurry today. And I get it. That's a whole nother podcast we could probably talk about at some point in time. And I get it. But I think it's important to share, because I also don't want people to give up. That's probably part of the hope, right? Is I know there were times throughout that journey where I am sure I lost hope. Remember a leader one time putting a pretty high level job ad description. They had cut it out of the paper dating me, but just put it on my desk and said, we're going to get you ready for a role like that someday, after my 6th failed interview or whatever, right? And so that's so far away. And the thing with him, it wasn't the next step. It was big steps ahead, and said, we'll get you ready for that someday. And so, yeah, I think that's part of what a leader has to do. Is we're all going to struggle. And I think it's really important to me as a leader is at times I know I'm going to have to believe more in somebody than what they believe in themselves. And I need them to understand that, hear me, and then we create a plan to get there.
How long ago was it that leader cut that ad out of the paper for you and showed you that?
Probably 15 years.
So 2 things there. I think the moment made a mark on you that you recall it 15 years later pretty easily. The second thing is, and I'm pretty sure of this, but you can correct me, if they didn't follow through on investing in you, that wouldn't be such a positive mark that you would remember at this point. But it sounds to me like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like that person cared enough about you to invest in you. In other words, it wasn't just a stunt, that he really meant it and then invested in you accordingly. Is that fair?
Yeah, as well as also made it crystal clear what was my responsibility in that as well. And it was fun because when I got to that position, I shot him a note and I said, remember? And he's like, I sure do. And he's like, I had no doubt or whatever. But like I said, once again, that was just a small glimmer of hope in a bad day. And I just think it was just so powerful. And I do remember it. Remember somebody of significance saying, hey, I see something in you and don't give up. And if this is something that you want, I'll do my part and we think we can get you there.
In the midst of sharing that story, you were authentic enough to say, hey, by the way, I haven't gotten every promotion I've applied for. In fact, it took me 7 tries to get to get that initial one. And it really is an example of something that I know that you believe around the issue of authenticity, that I think is a uniquely important perspective on that issue around letting others get to know you as a leader. Can you say a little bit more about how the value of that you see from the leadership seat?
When somebody's selected a leader or brought into an organization or whatever, I mean, I think one of the 101 things that tends to happen, right, is someone is like, hey, go spend time to get to know your new team or whatever it is. And I completely agree with that. But I also firmly believe you've got to allow them to get to know you. And that's really important because they need to know what's at your core, what your values are, what's important to you, how you see things, because it makes you more real to them, but it also lets them know why you may say something the way you say it, even. And that, most of the time, even if someone did not agree with what maybe I was saying or deciding or whatever it was, that they knew it came from a good place. And then what I think that's also allowed is just folks to have a more comfort feel of like, hey, I can go to Greg and I can say something. I'm not going to be judged in that moment. Now, I also know what his style is going to be and what it is, but it's advertised as such. And once again, in transparency, I've not done that before. And part of it was I actually just made the assumption that the end of this team that I was taking over, they knew me, but they didn't know me like that. And it was one of those things that's just like, wow, hadn't connected that dot necessarily in that particular space. It was the biggest I had grown a team. The teams up to that point, I had hired everybody and built them in, right? And so kind of knew this. So now I was absorbing a new team of people that knew me, but my responsibilities were growing. And so the good thing is not too long after that, I got an opportunity to do that again and absorb another team and did this piece or whatever. And it was vastly more successful just from, early buy-in and just understanding of like, hey, he's real and I can be real with him. And I get why certain things are important to him. I just think that's really valuable.
Yeah. Carey Nieuwhof says that the people that we're leading, they admire our accomplishments, but they connect with our failures. It turns out that after tons of research, we like to follow people rather than robots. I've even heard people talk about, and this makes so much sense to me, the idea if I can share what I think, people are going to get that because you have decisions that you're making. But really part of authenticity is sharing with people how you think. How did I come to that conclusion? And if we're willing to do that, there's a couple of things that happen. Number one, it starts to fill in that mosaic of like, I'm not Pinocchio, like I'm a real life boy or I'm a real life girl. And to be able to fill that story in, but also all of a sudden now we're connecting authenticity to talent development, because if somebody can get a chance to learn how our senior director thinks and all of the experiences that you've been through in your career, and this is how you evaluate the situation. Now, not only am I getting to know you, but I'm also learning.
I'm a big believer when I'm doing my job really well, in my opinion, is that I've got my folks coming to me, and instead of me being the answer button, easy button and answering a question, it's like, no. Let's talk through what you think we should do. And I tell them for one of three reasons. I said, first of all, you're not going to learn if I do the work for you. So that's not really helpful. I go, I'm incredibly arrogant if I think my answer is the best answer. So I can't afford to not hear what you have to say. And then third, the reality is there's probably going to be somewhere in the middle. And a lot of times just challenging them, then I'm like, hey, yeah, Tim, I'm like, that's a great idea. However, I go, what happens if this person reacts like this? What are you prepared to do? And then they're just eyes. I'm like, that's what, so it's just thinking through like beyond the very first answer to there. I think that's just a valuable way to do it. Like I said, I'm in my better leadership zone when I'm doing that and challenging my folks and asking them that question versus just answering them. Here's what I would do.
Southwest Airlines is famous for its service or servant leadership perspective. The idea that the leader is going to show up and the leader isn't there to be served by everybody, but the leader is to serve and care for others in a variety of different ways. From a leadership development standpoint, how do you develop that perspective in somebody? Here's an entire organization, iconic not only for this leadership principle, but by the way, and not unrelated, iconic for its ability to consistently crank out profit in an incredibly difficult industry to do that. Definitely connection points between those things. But these are really challenging things to develop in others. So as you watch what happens in the organization, as you look at the intentional efforts to grow and develop a service mentality or a servant's heart around leadership, how do you see that happening on a consistent basis in an organization the size of Southwest?
I think two things that are really special here is we have a department that is responsible for culture and a department that is responsible for leadership development. And Tim, I said departments, not a team of like 6 people, like a department with officer level individuals that kind of support. And then we're all responsible for it, right? All 63,000 of us have a lot of responsibility for our culture. Nobody owns it more than the next person. And then same thing on leadership development. We do have this organizational pieces that we do. And then there is, what an individual does. I will say too, though, that I think running kind of full circle on the talent acquisition piece, that is something that we're involved in every single leadership hire, whether it's internal or external. And so there are attributes, values, those things that we associate with. And I think they can be developed, but I also think there are some of them that I don't know if all of them can be built just absolutely from scratch, right? And so to me, it's if we were hiring somebody for leadership, there's some of those things that I just call, hey, this is table stakes to get this job. We're going to need to be able to see these things because that's just not something that we can afford, versus maybe taking somebody that is whatever department that they're in, that's an entry, and they kind of grow it and they learn it and they see it and then they emulate it. And that's the big thing. That's what I tell anybody that's going into leadership. I go, you are in a fishbowl, and the higher up you go, the more lonely that fishbowl is. I just tell them, I go, don't think that your team isn't always talking about you when you're not around. Like, it just is. And you've got to be okay with that. But you also have to be like, hey, they're watching you all the time. There's a lot of similarity, right, to at times being a parent, right? I mean, if you're like, have your kid do something, you're like, where did they learn that? And you're just like, holy, please don't do that in front of mom. I didn't say it like, that's not what I meant. That's not the word I meant, or whatever. So yeah, that's kind of one of those things that I think it's really important. I think that's one of the things the leaders at Southwest are instilled upon, is that someone is always looking and learning from you. And so are you leading by that example so that the next person up doesn't, not that they wouldn't do it differently than you or whatever, but do they know what those table stakes are?
So let's dive in and review just a few things that Greg shared with us. So many wise and thoughtful leadership ideas, but I want to start today with the issue of hope. Greg talked about leaders either giving it or taking it away. And as we're in leadership positions, are we aware of that? Are we thinking about the fact that I'm probably doing one or the other? There's not really a neutral, he said. Am I showing up in such a way to give hope that can lead to energy and accomplishment, or am I taking it away from the people that I'm leading? And he went on to say that self-care for him was part of his ability to show up hopeful. He talked about recharging himself, and he talked about looking for stories and examples that are hopeful so that he would then have something to give to others. So hope. Do we see hope as a responsibility for us as leaders to bring hope to those that we are leading? Second, he talked about vision, but he talked about it in a way that's a little bit unique and I think really important for us to think about and retain as we hear this conversation. He wasn't just talking about the broad, soaring vision of an organization or even a department. He was talking in part about the vision for the individual people that we are leading, their personal vision. So much is said in the leadership space about having vision and communicating it. Have you ever thought about taking that and applying it to the individuals on our teams? Greg shared that incredible story about having somebody that he was following put a fairly lofty job description in front of him and say, we are going to get you ready for that. And then, of course, it wasn't just the moment that made a difference. It was the follow-up to work towards that. So are we helping our people with their personal vision? Are we helping them see what's possible for them and even for their families as they think about growing and developing in their own careers? Are we engaging in those conversations? Finally, Greg talked about letting people know how what they are doing matters. And he talked about it, especially in those little things. We were using a sports analogy there as if we were looking at game film. And he talked about the running back's going to get in the end zone and everybody's going to cheer and the spotlight is going to be on that person. But what about all the other people that did the little unsung things that contributed to that happening? As leaders, if we want a team that is going to perform at the highest levels, we have to go out of our way to acknowledge and recognize when people are doing the little things. We need them to know just how important those little mundane things are every day. We need to compliment people when they answer the phone with a smile in their voice, because that gets a conversation, perhaps with an angry customer, off to a good start. Or when somebody clears a couple hours of their priorities and afternoon schedule to help a teammate who's in a tough spot trying to get a project done. When we see the people we are leading doing the little things that help bring the organization and our team towards success, we have got to be conscious to acknowledge that. And I will encourage you around this, because I think if you take it on, you're going to find not only are you filling the bucket of somebody you're leading, you'll find that you will be encouraged by participating in that as well. So that leads me to the question I want to leave you with today. When was the last time you sat down with the people you are leading and looked at the very basic and mundane things that they need to do for success and cheered them on? Let them know just how important those activities are. If you can't remember the last time you did that, then I encourage you to get to it as soon as possible. And if you can remember the last time you did it, then I encourage you to do it again soon. This is Tim Spiker reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your colleagues and friends. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.